welcome back to another episode of Vital Dissent. I'm your host, as always, Patrick McFarland. This one is episode 267, and the show notes may be found at vitaldissent.com/267. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about a very underreported story, and that is a Ynet investigation of the events of October 7th, Ynet being a very prominent news outlet in Israel. They conducted an investigation and found that there was an informal order for something called the Hannibal Directive. And we're going to be discussing that report. We're going to be talking about Brad Pierce, someone that we've had on the show in a very recent episode. His reporting on it, his early reporting on it, and a piece that he just came out with that also talks about the other English-speaking U.S. outlets that are reporting on this. But it is resigned to the alternative media and the independent media, rather, whatever word you want to say for it, term you want to use. And I think it's a story that has been lost a bit in the news cycle because things are just popping off right now, and it's crazy. But one of the largest things, you hear is that people who support Israel and support what they're doing, they will always wave the events of October 7th in front of your face. They'll claim the casualty numbers. They'll do all these things, but one thing they won't do is air their legitimate grievances that they should have with the IDF and Israeli leadership for dropping the ball, but also making the situation much worse with something called the Hannibal Directive. So we're going to be talking about that, but first I want to go through a couple of the headlines as they will be happening, because things, of course, are developing. And I just want to touch on them briefly because they're going to come up. They probably, as you're listening to this, we'll start with this one, is that the International Court of Justice announced today, as I'm recording, it's Wednesday night. I'm sure you won't hear this until Thursday or Friday, but the ICJ stated in an official press release that on Friday, January 26th, this coming Friday in 2 days, the ICJ will deliver its order on the request for the indication of provisional measures submitted by South Africa in the case concerning, the genocide case that we covered in meticulous and extensive detail in the last episode. My thanks for everyone's patience. I know that sometimes my episodes, usually clock in around an hour, but this one was an hour and 15. And I appreciate your attention and patience on that. I do realize that, this is a deep dive show, but at times it can be a bit more dry than other shows, just with the subject matter. And I try to keep it interesting, and I hope you think I'm doing an okay job with that. I think that I'm not going to go through the other stuff in this document, but I think that this application, or at least the press release coming through, is ahead of schedule historically. From what I understand, is that usually there's a 6-week gap between the hearing for, the request, the hearing of arguments on the issuing of provisional measures and the actual order coming out, the preliminary injunction, if you will, of provisional measures. This came out, I think, 2 weeks later, that the case concluded on January 12th, and now on the 24th, 12 days later, we're getting an order. And I think that is a good sign for South Africa's case, because I think that if the court was going to do something about it, they would want to do it as soon as possible if they're going to grant South Africa's petition, because what they would find is that there's reason to believe that either war crimes or ethnic cleansing or crimes against humanity or genocide is taking place in Israel, or in Gaza. And that the court is going to want to do something, because if that is happening, every day that they wait to take action is more people being killed. So I think that this foreshadows a positive result for South Africa's case. And if that happens, we've already heard talks about South Africa having a cross complaint or some kind of an additional complaint to have the U.S. be brought into this litigation as well, accusing them of complicity in genocide. And there are other discussions. I don't exactly remember what countries were going to bring actions as well. something, maybe a South American country was going to bring an action to declare that Israel's 85-year occupation of Palestine is itself, some kind of war crime or some kind of crime in of itself. It's not something that I briefed for the show today, but I do recall just seeing this. And I think that would be, it's incredibly interesting, and that's a proceeding I'd like to cover too. In some ways, it's actually, for my particular place in the movement and my particular skill set, court cases aren't always in this type of news that we talk about on this show. And I think in some way it's morbidly positive for me and my skill set that all of a sudden we're in a realm that I kind of have some expertise on, being a trial lawyer myself, albeit not in international, not a practiced attorney in international law. At any rate, we also have a claim developing tonight from the Houthis, Ansar Allah, as they are formally titled. They are claiming that they hit a U.S. military ship. This is Dave DeCamp's article from this afternoon. He updated it. He let me know that he updated it, saying that later in the day, the Houthis said that their forces engaged in a 2-hour battle with several U.S. warships. Houthi military spokesman Yahya Saraya claimed the confrontation resulted in a Houthi missile, quote, directly hitting an American warship, but so far the U.S. has not confirmed the account. I did see a tweet purporting to report on a statement from a U.S. official denying this account. I can't confirm the authenticity of that tweet, however, but Dave provided this link to Al-Mayadeen. I don't know exactly, it's Al-Mayadeen's English page, but it quotes the Houthi spokesperson. So I'll try and put a link there in the show notes page to this story here, but you can see it on screen if you're watching the video version. But it is linked in Dave DeCamp's article from today on antiwar.com. U.S. bombs Yemen for 9th time. Houthis attack U.S. commercial ship. The title refers to an earlier attack, not the one we're talking about where the Houthis are claiming to have hit an American vessel. So those are two important developments I just wanted to touch on, following up especially on the ICJ case and the announcement that we're going to get a decision on Friday. I would anticipate that I'm going to try and hit that story as soon as it happens, with some kind of maybe a short episode just developing, reporting on that development and kind of doing a bit of initial analysis. This episode will probably come out either Thursday or Friday, but look out either for a live stream, maybe, but an episode in of itself. So Brad Pierce, I've been following Brad's writing. I think he's emerging as a very, he's been around for, I don't know, maybe a year or two. Brad, sorry if I'm getting this wrong, but he's really emerging as I think, an important voice. And I think that his reporting on the Hannibal Directive in action, as he writes about in this article, a Hannibal Directive by any other name that he released 2 days ago on the 22nd, he mentions that he was one of the first people, at least reporting on this possibility and questioning what was being said and what was being claimed by the IDF and in the mass media. But don't just take my word for it. We're going to go through this article, probably not the entire article, because like me, Brad also, he writes and produces a lot, but I think it's valuable because both of us try to, provide a lot of depth and analysis. So the IDF is accused of causing mass civilian casualties on October 7th is his subtitle here at his Substack, The Wayward Rabbler. I'll put a link in the show notes page. Definitely go and follow Brad, follow his writings. So on Friday, January 12th, Ynet News, a major Israeli news website, released the stunning results of an investigation titled The First Hours of Black Saturday. So you can see this. It is a Hebrew language source, Ynet. So the original story is written in Hebrew. What Brad did is that he did an auto translate of the article. I think the day that it came out, he had his finger on the pulse of this, maybe the day it came out or the day after. And he did a thread on Twitter, which, as he said, was like for a long time the top Google result if you Googled Ynet. He elaborates in his article. I won't put words in his mouth, but he did a great long Twitter thread summarizing the article itself. So I'll try to remember to put all these links in the show notes page so you can go through. And he summarized the auto translation through Google or whatever app he used to translate it. And a lot of this is really eyebrow raising about how things developed on the ground. And I think rather than go through the Ynet article, maybe I'll just kind of go through his thread here. He used Yandex's auto translate, which is imperfect, but I think the important part about it is that it wasn't translated by a human with human biases. Although a computer translation is not the best translation just by a factor of some errors, but he said you can form whatever opinion you want, and I like Brad and his stance on things because I think he tends to be a bit, I know what Brad thinks and where he's coming from, but I think he tends to be a bit more objective than even I am. Of course, I'm not objective. I never purport to be objective, but sometimes I try to be in this show. But he says Ynet is a major Israeli publication that employs top quality investigators. According to Ynet, Israel issued a Hannibal Directive on civilians, killing an unknown number. The findings of Ynet's investigation. Overnight on the 6th and 7th, there were signs something was wrong. By 4 a.m., high-level officers were in the operations room and a specialized team had been dispatched to the border to investigate a variety of suspicious activities. Though many people were in the command center, the decision wasn't made to call the prime minister until just before 6:30 a.m. and the missile sirens began going off while they were on the phone with Netanyahu, waking up to perhaps the worst day of his life. Or maybe the best. I don't know, Brad. And the only reason I would say that is because now, all the corruption scandals and investigations he was under before October 7th are now seemingly forgotten and put off, at least in as long as he can prolong this military operation. And it's not fair that I'm talking about Brad's article in his absence. I suppose I could have called them to come back on, but arranging guests is just, I've been sick and it's not something that I've been trying to do and fit my schedule around just right now. So in the control room, he says the pit, as they call it, was an absolute madness. A combination of factors including shock and horror, but more importantly, Hamas attacking communications created a catastrophe in the pit. After the initial rocket attack at 6:26, planes went into the air but had no instructions about what to do. No one knew the size of the attack. Many flew around aimlessly for 45 minutes without enough intel to even fly low and scare Hamas, which I think is crazy if you think about the cost of fuel and logistics for doing that. Although, it was a special occasion. It was an incident. For years, Israel had targeted its defense budget against Iran and downplayed the threat from Gaza. Its attack helicopters were mostly positioned against Lebanon, and the force was gutted from budget cuts. Early on, only 2 Apaches were in the air. And again, I'm reading from Brad's Twitter thread, summarizing panels, screenshots from the machine-translated article. He says, continues, observation balloons had fallen in the days leading up to the attack, fallen in quotes, and Hamas taking down communication devices, including with suicide drones. The pit was virtually blind. So there are communications. The incident center for the IDF had no intel coming in to make decisions on. It took several hours to understand the extent of the breach even. Damage to communications was so severe that Israel's main command center relied on TV news broadcasts and Hamas Telegram channels to learn what was going on. One commander mobilized in response to a personal phone call from a friend during this time. Drone operators lacked orders and were deciding on strikes on their own, in one instance nearly firing upon 5 IDF soldiers. With 110 strikes from a single squadron with no intel but drone cameras, we have no way of knowing how many were the right decisions, so maybe some of these strikes did hit IDF soldiers. There's at least one confirmed case of that happening. Almost happening, rather, to be clear, almost happening. And what I did just say was speculation, but I think it's informed speculation. With the Southern Command Center taken over, every commander was left on his own with no intel and functionally told to get men together and find terrorists to fight. Every commander thought he was in the main battle. There were about 80 points of combat in reality. When soldiers were finally mobilized, they were not made aware of what they would be facing. More importantly, Israel's entire protocol was for facing small groups entering through tunnels, not a large invasion, which they didn't believe was possible. This is around 4th, let's see. There's no timestamp included on that. It looks like it was before 8 o'clock in the morning. Brad says at 8 in the morning, they still didn't understand the scale of the attack. Soldiers are told to disregard all regulations and, quote, free fire. Intel was so bad that UAV operators made personal phone calls to friends on the ground for help targeting. Apache helicopters are told to, quote, shoot at anyone who enters our territory without waiting for permission, which is to say, kill anything that moves. Everyone who can carry a weapon was mobilized, whether or not they were in any combat division. 5 hours into the attack, the IDF was still fighting without proper equipment, without proper orders, and did not know the extent of the breach. In short, Israel, quote, may have a right to defend itself, but they were not prepared to do so on October 7th, he says. At noon, IDF command remains completely blinded by hubris, unable to accept the enormity of their failure, and still believing Hamas could only breach a maximum of 2 points. The border was breached in reality at 30 points and not just 2 points. At this point, the Hannibal Directive is issued, a controversial and repealed military order to prioritize stopping the enemy over the safety of hostages, i.e., kill them all. In the past, this only applied to the IDF. Never has it been policy for civilians. And Brad touches on this again in his full article. It is unknown how many Israeli civilians were killed by declaring the Hannibal Directive, but 70 vehicles were completely destroyed by IDF explosives, in some instances killing everyone inside. Hence these pictures that and I remember having Brad on the show, I think we discussed this explicitly, this picture of the burned out cars, I think leaving the music festival. I'm not quite positive that these are the same cars, but I think that's what we talked about in our episode, kind of questioning the official narrative of, was Hamas capable of burning out these cars? He says, despite everything that had happened, 6 hours after the attack, the IDF was still using the assessment from the command center that had been overran, saying the risk of an attack was very low. The enemy was perhaps 10 times what they believed. So this is around 12:30 noon that day. Later, Brad says an intelligence officer would claim Hamas was instructed to not run from attack helicopters so they would be believed to be fleeing Israelis and would not be shot. In short, at no point could the IDF differentiate between Hamas and their own citizens. The IDF says it will look into all this later and publish its findings. Do you trust them to tell the truth? Brad says. It seems as if they have much to hide. This is an unparalleled failure of security for one of the world's most militarized states, one that we've been giving billions and billions of dollars to for years. That last bit was my editorialization. But there are many things one could say about this, but clearly what is described as a military invasion by Hamas, not a Holocaust, and it is clear that the IDF's panicked and botched response killed many Israeli citizens, soldier and civilian alike. For now, suffice to say, the Ynet investigation goes far in explaining Israel's insane messaging. The Hamas attack was brutal, but they need their response sacred and immune to questioning, because it was wildly irresponsible and killed an unknown number of Israelis. So there's also a link to Brad's publication on Substack, The Wayward Rabbler. And I appreciated the addition of this meme, which is it's A Few Good Men. It's a meme from A Few Good Men where Tom Cruise is questioning the witness at the end of the trial, and played by Jack Nicholson, playing a hardened military commander. And it says, "Coming soon to a military tribunal near Tel Aviv." Tom Cruise says, "Did you order the Hannibal Directive?" And Nicholson says, "I did the job Tom Cruise asks again, "Did you order the Hannibal Directive?" And Jack Nicholson says, "You're damn right I did." So funny. It looks like that's Brad's original meme that he made, so I appreciated that.
Welcome to the portion of the show where I tell you how you can help support this content. The best way to do that, guys, is to go to libertyweekly.club. Yes, I haven't changed the URL yet, but this is my membership website that also functions as a newsletter. So if you go to that website, libertyweekly.club, hit the subscribe button in the upper right-hand corner, and you can subscribe for the free newsletter, and I send out a lot of free content. However, there is a section in those free emails that is premium, and that premium section includes early access to my episodes, access to bonus episodes, and preprints of my articles before they're published at the Libertarian Institute or other outlets. So again, go to the website, hit subscribe in the top right-hand corner, and sign up for that email list. You go through the page here and you can see all the content that I've set out in the past. There's a whole bunch of it, guys, and you get access to those previous emails that have gone out as well. Another way to help support me is to go to vitaldescent.com/stitchfix and sign up through my link there. You'll get $25 off your first order, and I will also get a $25 credit. Guys, I use this to buy my wardrobe. I'm a father of two. I have my own business. I do this, and I don't have time to go shopping. Can't haul the wife and kids around to have a leisurely shop for myself to pick these clothes. So what Stitch Fix does is that they pick the clothes for you. They send them to you in fixes, and it's really awesome stuff. These are all the pieces that I personally have bought myself. There's a lot of work stuff in there, but there's also casual stuff. I got an awesome plaid shirt that's in there, a flannel, really love that. I got this really cool sweatshirt. I got these awesome boots and a nice windbreaker, really good stuff. So go on over to vitaldescent.com/stitchfix. You can also get Vital Descent, really hard not to say Liberty Weekly, Vital Descent merchandise with the cool, awesome new logo from Mises Pieces. You can get all these kinds of things, all this merch. You got coffee cups, pint glasses, sweatshirts, premium t-shirts, premium sweatshirts, all that good stuff there at vitaldescent.com/merch. Also, guys, I started a TikTok channel, and I think that'll be really cool, trying to get more eyeballs on this content and more views. You can see it's already garnering a bunch of views, where I do anti-war cartoon reviews and a lot of cool stuff there. So vitaldescent.com/TikTok is where you can find me. My handle is at @PatMcFarlane_, the same as my Twitter handle. Okay, guys, that's about it. Check out those things. Please help support this content. Help me pay my producer and make the show better for you guys. Thanks.
So again, here's the Ynet story. It's published on December 1st. January 12th, 2024. I got the dates wrong. So on January 12th, 2024, they published that story. Brad comes across it on January 7th. So about 5 days later, he writes this thread. Then on the 22nd, he writes this, and he talks a little bit about other English source coverage. And so we'll bring up when those dates said. But so on Friday, January 12th, they released that investigation, the first hours of Black Saturday. It was released, Brad writes, with such little fanfare that though I was actively looking for it, having seen an earlier preview, I could not find it until the Gray Zone's Max Blumenthal posted it to Twitter on Tuesday. So that was, that would explain the gap in Brad's Twitter thread about it. But it seems like Max Blumenthal found it and posted it on Twitter, and it was not able to be found before then. Brad said it remains so hidden on the English language internet that my thread summarizing the article is currently the only relevant result if you search Google for it. If you search literally the first hours of Black Saturday, Ynet, Brad's Twitter thread is the first thing that comes up. This means that even knowing the name of the article and the source, you still would not find it, if not for Max having posted the link and my having written out a thread. Electronic Intifada released an article by Asa Winstanley with a human translation on January 20th, but the story has not come close to, quote, breaking quarantine and reaching mainstream news sources. So, James Corbett talked about this. The Library of Alexandria is burning, I think was the title of his episode, talking about how, things are being wormholed actively on the internet. And, isn't it funny how, if you search this on Google and you have the name of the article and the publication, it won't come up. So interesting. It's easy to see why Israel supporters don't want the world to know about this investigation. While Ynet discovered that the response of the IDF was one of shocking panic and incompetence, they also discovered something more nefarious. Though the name wasn't said, some high-level person in Israel's military establishment issued a Hannibal Directive on the civilians at large. The Hannibal Directive was a controversial Israeli military protocol for kidnapping situations which prioritized stopping the kidnappers over saving the life of the hostage. And of itself, that is ethically questionable, and they did not consult legal experts when they came up with it. But it is at least an understandable rule for a soldier who has been instructed on what may happen if he is captured by the enemy. Beyond what Ynet discovered in its investigation, there was a separate accusation of the IDF shelling a house it knew contained hostages with a tank. We talked about that already. And a third accusation that attack helicopters shot attendants at the Nova Music Festival. So we talked about that the last time Brad was on. Taken together, these accusations, I just realized the article text is really small in the video. Taken together, these accusations, all from Israeli mainstream media, imply that Israel caused mass casualties among Israeli civilians with its wild response to the October 7th attacks. On January 17th, Haaretz, Israel's newspaper of record, right, like the New York Times in the United States, published an article in English about an interview with Asa Kasher, a professor emeritus of philosophy at Tel Aviv University, titled Unlawful, Unethical, Horrifying, IDF Ethics Code Author on Alleged Use of Hannibal Directive During Hamas Attack. Kasher is the lead author of the Code of Ethics of the IDF, which is to say he is the country's leading ethicist regarding IDF behavior, which Brad kind of says, then it's fair to assume that a lot of his job in that role is justifying unethical behavior. I mean, we kind of talked about that, and Ron DeSantis and his time as a JAG officer writing, defending U.S. soldiers from ethics complaints, ostensibly, or, facilitating torture of detainees at Guantanamo Bay, as reported. Kasher's set of reports that Israel had applied a version of the Hannibal Directive to civilian captives on October 7th, quote, in both the original order and the current version, there is absolutely nothing that would allow for someone to kill an Israeli citizen, whether he is in uniform or not. By this, he means that the Hannibal Directive only ever allowed for stopping terrorists from escaping with hostages, even if it might cause an Israeli to die, not, for example, shelling a house full of Israelis, be they civilians or soldiers. Instead, the direct text of the order allows actions such as using single-shot sniper fire at the driver in an escape car, knowing there's a high risk of hitting the captive. So I think this is pretty important that the IDF departed from even its own ethically questionable policy, according to the guy who wrote the policy itself. But this would be, the reports that we're getting is a large departure from even that written policy that was, Brad reports, was repealed. So Kasher further says of the house shelled on October 7th, quote, on the surface, this sounds totally unacceptable from every aspect, against orders, against procedure, against values, against ethics, and possibly against the law. He wants an immediate investigation, unlike the IDF, who say they will look into this at some undefined time after the war. It is not a small matter for accusations like this to float around the citizenry of a society, all the more so when made by leading public figures and published by top news sources, which are widely considered to be credible. So incredible. It's hard to come to a different conclusion from all this info than that Israel made a conscious, if panicked, decision to not show concern for minimizing casualties among its own citizens on October 7th. It also means that the journalists and others who said Israel knowingly killed many civilians on October 7th were correct about what happened that day, and those attacking them as conspiracy theorists and anti-Semites were wrong. These claims do much to explain Israel's erratic and ineffective communication strategy from as soon as the attack occurred. Brad says, I had realized some time ago that they must have caused unacceptable civilian casualties, or else they would not be demanding that you believe insane atrocity propaganda and would instead focus on things Hamas really did. But I did not imagine how bad it was. I myself denied that they could have issued a Hannibal Directive, and it appears I was wrong. This will all have enormous repercussions for Israel as a whole, since their social contract is broken and they most likely need public indictments of top figures for their state to survive. So really interesting. Sorry, I'm looking at my OBS recording software here, looking for the pause button so I can like stop and figure out, what else I want to read from this article and take a drink like I usually do. But I don't find the pause button, and I think I might have updated the software and now I just don't know where it is. So that sucks. He says, a state knowingly mass killing its own citizens in an attempt to repel an attack is not the sort of thing people easily move past, especially when the state is one of the most militarized in the world and has defined its entire survival strategy around security. Very true. So he does say before the Ynet report, there were already serious reports and accusations of the IDF firing on Israeli citizens. Like he had mentioned before, the helicopters at the music festival, here's the Haaretz report. Israeli security establishment, Hamas likely didn't have advanced knowledge of Nova Festival. So some things that we were talking about already. But, it turns the burns out cars were in there. Yeah, so I'm just looking for the specific part where they talk about the helicopters. Yeah, according to a police source, the investigation also indicates that an IDF combat helicopter that arrived to the scene and fired at terrorists there apparently also hit some festival participants. Oh, geez. Yeah, crazy. I mean, according to police, 364 people were killed at the festival. So that was one report. The shelling at the house at the kibbutz here, Times of Israel, IDF officer recounts ordering tank fire on Be'eri home during hostage standoff on October 7th. So there's a report on that too. In the first instance, it could be easily written off as a mistake, and some friendly fire is inevitable when countering an attack on the size of 10-7 in populated areas. The shelling of the house, though admitted to be deliberate by a commander involved, is still an individual on the ground making a difficult decision. Israel has also had more problems of this nature in the time since October 7th, not just an unknown number of hostages killed by airstrikes. So he's just saying, that when these reports first emerged, some of them could be kind of explained or written off or mitigated in some way. They didn't directly indicate the size and scale of this, of a Hannibal Directive being ordered, as reported by Ynet. He says what the Ynet article describes is an entirely different degree, though they don't imply who it may have come from. But what Ynet reports clearly indicates that a service-wide order went out to the IDF for a mass Hannibal Directive to stop the return of hostages to Gaza. In my opinion, such an order could only be given by the chief of the general staff of the IDF, Herzi Halevi, and would only be given with the approval of Defense Minister Yoav Gallant and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. So, this is in Brad's opinion. He's not reporting it as fact, but that's what he thinks. So he talks about the key points. We already kind of went through that in the Twitter thread. The Electronic Intifada article is also out. That is not an unbiased translation because Electronic Intifada is a Palestinian activist outlet. So I mean, take that as you will. Some translations do matter. They can be, certain words can be chosen. But here's the full English translation of the article. If you want to read it, it's linked in Brad's piece here. So he says, there's little public good in punishing soldiers on the ground for errors made in this state of panic. Since it's a system-wide failure, there are few who could be prosecuted for these mistakes, as it would rarely be the case of one individual's liability reached a level of criminality. However, an op-ed in Haaretz titled "A Series of Failures Proves That Israel's Security Concept is Obsolete" does make a strong argument that the lesson here is that peace and cooperation within the region is the only way Israel can go forward. So again, we already went through the whole thing. He talks about Max Blumenthal and his piece, which we'll touch on briefly. But he does Brad makes a few important observations, I think, of the public reaction to this event in the United States. He says that anyone that himself and anyone looking at Twitter and watching the events unfold was probably just as well informed as the IDF was in the pit in their command center, if we're to believe the Ynet article. The conflict quickly broke up the teams in the United States where people had fallen on the same side of the last several current things. And I think this is an interesting point. We were in the vaccine and Ukraine support split. And then after that, we learned that the Ron DeSantis supporters, in fact, liked his awful foreign policy and were not just tolerating it because of his views on COVID and wokeness. He says, really, as I keep saying, quote, Israel is just pronouns for conservatives, which is totally 100% true. And their belief in free speech goes right out the window as soon as something is said about Israel that hurts their feelings. They don't care at all that supporting Israel is bad for America's national security. Was America First ever really a thing? Alternately, a fair amount of wokesters are Jewish liberal Zionists, and though they may hate Netanyahu, immoderate language from the left drove them away quickly. The point is, regardless of which side a man was on, at least some of his political fellow travelers turned out to be on a different side about Israel, commonly because of religious or ethnic prejudices, but also for a variety of other reasons, and it became quite uncomfortable for many. The discourse was heated and often did not stay friendly. Yeah, and just a quick note, I mentioned this because I went on a live stream with our friends in the Indie News Network, which are more left-leaning anti-war activists, and I think it's an important bridge to be. I'll try and put a link to this in the show notes page. I'm just making so much work for myself. But we were talking about this, how, it seemed, and I think I mentioned this on recent shows too, that it seemed like we had this position. It was on Kyle Matovic's show talking with Connor Freeman, that it seems like we were always skeptical of the new right, or not the new right, the anti-war right, the new emerging anti-war right, and the America First conservatives, oftentimes MAGA conservatives, and always kind of knew that they were standing up against escalating the war in Ukraine and all this U.S. support and trying to end it. And, Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene were coming out with good statements, and Marjorie Taylor Greene, I think she was introducing legislation, or at least making a public call out that we should not support this disaster. And it was great. But we were suspicious of them, and we were always chastised by some people in the movement. And at times it got, a little heated with them. But I think that, their perspective was their perspective was valuable at the time. But I think that in a way we had the right approach, which was to, I don't know if trust but verify, is that good? I don't know if that's a good way to phrase it, but at least to try to encourage these actions that are, praise the good and criticize the bad, which I think we did a lot of, and I think we were relatively fair about it, but to not throw out, stick to your gut reaction and your principles while still trying to be practical about it and make, political alignments and encouragements and support things that are good, but don't forget who these people are, right? Because we saw immediately who they were. Once, remember with the whole the Chinese weather balloon that went over the United States, the spy balloon, and we saw, Marjorie Taylor Greene being one of the most aggressively hawkish people about it, urging for military action. I wrote a whole piece about this. And or at least, for shooting it down without any kind of diplomacy or verification of exactly what it was. And of course, soon after this happens, you get the same people coming out as being like some of the most ardent Zionist Israel supporters throughout this whole thing. So that, and Dave DeCamp wrote a tweet very soon after about, well, goodbye, anti-war right. It was nice to know you while you were here, because it certainly is over now. So there was a Brad continues back to his article. There was a moderate amount of tolerance for respectfully phrased views critical of Israel, such as, quote, I condemn the atrocities of Hamas, but think peace will only come from an equitable treatment of Palestinians, or, quote, I condemn Hamas, but their crimes shouldn't give Israel a free hand to destroy Gaza. However, what about those of us who questioned what would turn out to be lies, such as the 40 beheaded babies, which was not at all real, or stories of mass rape when Israel cannot locate a single victim? So I wrote an article about this at the Institute. It was the last article that I wrote. We were called every kind of monsters for questioning these stories. Of course, very few, if any, of the people who told or repeated lies, including Joe Biden, have apologized. No doubt some young children were killed and some women were raped if there was widespread combat, and 20,000 looters entered Israel. But the story was that those crimes were planned by Hamas and committed systematically, which does not appear to be at all true. And I skipped over the portion where he talks about that above, saying that the first wave of the attack was Hamas, Hamas special forces, and I think Palestinian Islamic Jihad. But there was a second wave that turned out to be like a wave of looters of Palestinians exiting Gaza and like rushing out and doing a whole bunch of, I don't know if it was looting or I don't know if there's any claims that there was widespread like vigilante violence or anything like that. I haven't seen anything like that. But it added to the confusion, certainly. So what Brad is saying here is certainly true, is that doesn't indicate, something that Hamas planned for 20,000 looters to enter Israel, which goes along with the way that Scott Horton characterizes it by saying, well, what was October 7th? It was a jailbreak, right? That seems like to be exactly what it was. So anyways, he also, Brad mentions his Zaka piece that we discussed at length in my interview with him, but that a lot of the evidence, we got on October 7th had sourced directly from this Zaka rescue organization. So Brad talks a little bit more about how this story has been hidden from the public, that no one's discussing it. He says, as it stands, I'm yet to see any Israel supporters even acknowledged claims in both Haaretz and Ynet that a Hannibal Directive was issued. We can be sure the journalists who were correct have only generated more hatred toward themselves. But with their cries in the wilderness, they were able to make straight in the desert a highway, which is Isaiah chapter 40, verse 3 from the Bible. For the rest of us to follow, to quote a text which is said influential in Israel. So he has more analysis of what he thinks this means in Israel and what it means for the future of the conflict that we're not going to go through because we're coming up on our hour here. But what I mentioned on this show that I did with the Indie News Network with Reef Breland and Misty Winston, all I could think of was Sarcasm and Stardust, her Twitter handle. I've had discussions with some family members that are more pro Israel, and mentioning the credible reports from Israel itself that the IDF fired on its own citizens, and that there was mistaken attacks on Israeli citizens leaving the music festival, and everything that I just got done talking about. Just completely, don't want to hear it. We're just going to agree to disagree, which is fine. It is what it is. But I think the strength of this, and what I was saying too, was that if I was a Zionist Jew, if I lived in Israel, I would be furious, even if I was, even if I did support Israel kicking the Palestinians out and all the treatment and everything like that. I think the majority of my wrath would go towards, or a large part of it would go towards, the incompetence of the IDF and Israeli political leadership. And indeed, I think we're seeing some of that. I think we are seeing that Netanyahu's time is limited, that a lot of Israelis are calling for, and indeed were before this even took place, we're calling for Netanyahu to step down, to be investigated, maybe even imprisoned and tried, but at the very least removed from power. That I would be furious at how all this unfolded, and the prospect of a great number of the Israeli casualties occurring on October 7th being the result of incompetence and friendly fire. And now it seems some kind of a directive saying that my relatives and my friends and my neighbors, that their lives are not worth it, that they need to be killed because the utility to Hamas of having them as captives is more detrimental to the state of Israel than the valuing of Israeli lives. That would make me furious. Of course, if I was a Zionist, I would probably blame everything, say everything is Hamas's fault, no matter what incompetence that the IDF showed on that day. But I digress. Let's go through, at least I want to give some air to Max Blumenthal's October 27th report. Now, again, this is very close in time, but he says October 7th testimonies reveal Israel's military shelling Israeli citizens with tanks and missiles. Now, these were according to some of the early reports that Brad mentioned as well. So we have Max Blumenthal reporting on that very, very close in time. Here's Mondo Weiss, October 22nd. A growing number of, I kind of remember when these stories were coming out from these outlets. A growing number of reports indicate Israeli forces responsible for Israeli civilian and military deaths following October 7th attack. And one question is Hannibal Directive in action right there. This is the Mondo Weiss. On Friday, October 20th, Haaretz published a lengthy article by its senior military analyst, Amos Harrell, describing Israel's failure to prepare for Hamas's October 7th attacks. He introduces his readers to the commander of the Gaza division, Brigadier General Avi Rosenfeld, whom he met a few weeks before the war, and heard from him that, quote, things won't get better. At some point, they'll get worse. He goes on to describe what happened October 7th. Quote, the coordination and liaison office was attacked on October 7th, together with all the outposts along the division's line. A large Hamas force seized the adjacent Eretz crossing, which was closed for the Simat Torah holiday. From there, within minutes and with no resistance, they advanced into the military base, killing and kidnapping the soldiers of the civil administration, though a few of them managed to return fire before being hit. Brigadier General Rosenfeld entrenched himself in the division's subterranean war room together with a handful of male and female soldiers, trying desperately to rescue and organize the sector under attack. Many of the soldiers, most of them not combat personnel, were killed or wounded outside. The division was compelled to request an aerial strike against the base itself in order to repulse the terrorists. That's like Broken Arrow. If any of you have seen We Were Soldiers, the Vietnam movie with Mel Gibson. So, yeah, interesting. I mean, all this reporting here. So I would go back. I would tell everyone to read this. This full report. You know, can Israel handle the truth about this? When is this story? How is it going to come out? What are the repercussions going to be in Israel for this? Especially with, you know, a society so founded on militarism and its own security being the essential. I mean, the entire founding ethos of Israel, right, is that, well, we need a place in the world that's safe for Jews. Come to Israel. Just crazy and incredibly interesting development. So, yeah, the last episode was 2.5 hours. I think I'm going to cut it short there. Put a bookend on this. Put all these links in the show notes page at vitaldescent.com/267. You can get more of the details on the specific instances of the Hannibal Directive. At least, you know, the Hannibal Directive in anything but name. And it talks, at least the Electronic Intifada article, they have the translation, and then the first part of it has a little like editorialization, or at least like a write-up about it, and gives more background to who wrote the investigative piece, why it's credible, and kind of the respecting the source of it. Okay. All right. Well, thanks a lot, guys. I appreciate you sticking with me. Head on over to vitaldescent.com. I do see there were, you know, like 1,100 downloads of the last episode, even though it was 2.5 hours long. Really do appreciate it. And we'll provide continuing coverage of the ICJ ruling and any developments, any court developments. I also caught wind of an ICC complaint being served on, I think, the Israeli president when he was in Switzerland for the Davos summit. I heard something about that. I haven't heard anything more recently of it, but hopefully we're not in a full-scale war with Iran and with the Houthis. Man, there's so many headlines here just looking at antiwar.com. So many like blinking red warning lights. You know, the State Department official refusing to condemn Israel for shooting a group of Palestinians that were waving a white flag. And then, you know, U.S. forces in Iraq coming under direct attacks. I saw a report today that U.S. troops will be withdrawing from Syria. I don't know what the extent of that is, but at least, you know, U.S. soldiers in Iraq and Syria being a tripwire for war with Iran. It's just insane shit. So, okay, thanks again, guys. We'll catch you next time. Peace.